All right, kids, I'm that unhappy, miserable leftist you've heard about. You know this. Just like I know that the negativity I give you every week doesn't match the freak of the positive, optimistic name of this here channel. Yeah, at the end of each episode, I will tell y'all that we're going to be okay. But before then, it's F this, F that, and F them. And by them, I mean, of course, other leftists. However, I'd rather it be this way with the infighting than to be like a particular group of individuals.
But the ideology was so deep set in my mind that you couldn't have told me that there wasn't racism and patriarchy around me. So to realize that the systems and institutions in this country are actually founded to make me successful, that was such a big relief. It was one thing to feel deceived and tricked by the left, but it was another thing to get the relief that sort of comes along with conservatism and being able to know that you are fully accountable for how successful that you are.
That was Amala Ekmanobi in a video she made for the Daily Wire called From Unhappy Liberal to Hopeful Conservative. It's essentially a why I left the left kind of thing. And you know what? When she said you are fully accountable for how successful you are, I kind of agree. I mean, once you get past the fact that the police are more likely to stop you during the daytime because it's harder to discern race at night, those with black sounding names are less likely to get callbacks for jobs even when controlling for what's on a resume, white people with criminal records will get called back more than black people without a criminal record. Black people who have locks, braids, bantu knots, and what have you are less likely to be taken seriously during job interviews and could even lose jobs along with getting suspended or expelled from school due to how their hair looks. And don't even get me started on access to land and housing and banking, all stuff that I've previously talked about with you, my positive audience. But yes, you, me, us, we are responsible for our success after we overcome all that. Amala Ekmanobi also said in her video that she was told by her employer, a supervisor at some liberal agency, that she was oppressed. And while I'm not one to dunk on anybody's personal experience, I will reject that and wag my finger. That never happened. Get that weak out of here.
No. Not today.
R.I.P. to the Dikembe Mutombo. Dealing with this negativity of mine is my mountain to climb. And this isn't fair to Amala. Leave a comment and let me know if you too have lied about being told you were oppressed. With that said, still, it's this.
So all you young, depressed lefties watching.
No wonder these people are miserable. This is insane.
It was Donald Trump's election that really put the progressives into the miserable category.
Has anyone ever noticed that there's just no happiness on the left? They're not happy. They're not happy people, and for good reason. Thank you very much.
Study after study, it turns out, finds conservatives happier than liberals.
Today we're going to talk about a specific side of the political spectrum being unhappy or less happy than the other side. Surveys show that liberals, especially liberal women, are significantly less likely to be happy with their lives and less satisfied with their mental health compared to their conservative peers aged 18 to 55. These graphs, presented by the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, showed that the 2022 American Family Survey from YouGov and Deseret News found that liberals are about 15 percentage points less likely to be completely satisfied with their lives, including less happy with family. So, I'm not going to focus on trying to debunk this. And I can look at MAGA, for instance, and point out all the mean-spirited things they've done, which probably make them happy. Furthermore, I'm not going to make fun of conservatives and say ignorance is bliss, eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, or Rocky IV because I can't think of any more movie titles that fit this narrative of stupid meatbags without realizing that the one I just named also works just on another level. No, I'm going to make an appeal to all of us on the left. Stay mad, be bitter, nobody smiling. As you're about to see, there are black leftists, past and present, who are accountable for how successful they are, were, and going to be, but want those around them to succeed as well. However, seeing how injustice, inequality, and idiots have an impact on the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for others, tense your jaw and shoulders, tighten your entire body. Let's complain.
Before we get going, are there any moms for liberty in the house? Moms for liberty? No? Good. Then hands will not need to be thrown tonight.
LeVar Burton.
You don't.
You may know him from Roots, Star Trek The Next Generation, and Reading Rainbow. And before I continue, he wasn't going to actually throw hands with Moms for Liberty. I assume he would get the two women who sung the theme song to Reading Rainbow, Tina Fabrique and Shaka Khan, to get in there. Shaka Khan said politics is BS and all lives matter, so there's that. Anyways, LeVar Burton called out Moms for Liberty at the National Book Awards last year. When Moms for Liberty responded, they said, American moms weep as a childhood favorite, Reading Rainbow, calls for physical attacks against us because we are protecting the innocence of our children. LeVar Burton, why have you sunk so low, threatening physical violence against women? Do you know how smug you have to be to not understand that you had it coming when, as their co-founder put it, somebody who has been so influential in the lives of children can stoop so low as to threaten their mothers, referring to the man who gave their children literacy. If these were the people in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, even he would go home as usual, take off his sweater and remove his shoes just to make it easier to put a foot up there. As for if he were joking or not, if Moms for Liberty or anybody else really had LeVar Burton ready to squabble, shouldn't they?
I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book. Reading Rainbow. Reading Rainbow. Set phasers to love me.
If you didn't know, Moms for Liberty is an organization that started in Florida in 2021, but has since expanded to school boards all over the country and is considered an extremist group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. According to PEN America, there were over 3,000 instances of book banning during the 2022-23 school year, and Moms for Liberty had played a role in this, speaking out against queerness and race being included in school curriculum. Not only do they, and did they, want to ban books by Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, they're more than okay with libraries losing funding and closing, which doesn't help kids, let alone assistant students being fully accountable for how successful they can be. It's kind of like Moms for Liberty is being funded by right-wing groups to hide true American history, which means already happy conservatives are finding joy in all this, somehow not ashamed of themselves. Meanwhile, a man who may best be known as playing Kunta Kinte, who lost a job on PBS for dumb reasons, who was played out of hosting Jeopardy, a position he seemed destined to have, is still optimistic enough to tell us to read the books they're banning. That's where the good stuff is. With that said,
I want my guests to know, while I am unquestionably their friend, I am also absolutely filled with rage.
Woke people are more likely to be unhappy, anxious, and depressed, suggests a new study from earlier this year. Leftists weren't always unhappy and miserable. Jamie Napier, a Yale social psychologist, told PBS that in 1974, the difference in happiness between conservatives and liberals was not statistically significant. Yet, a decade prior, a wise man was saying, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all the time.
I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive.
Writer and activist James Baldwin, who in 1961 was responding to a radio host that asked about being black in America. Now, continuing the quote I stated a minute ago, and part of the rage is this: it isn't only what is happening to you, but it's what's happening all around you and all of the time in the face of the most extraordinary and criminal indifference of most white people in this country and their ignorance. That's pretty much where leftists are coming from. See, James Baldwin was born in 1924, raised in Harlem, and he felt like Harlem, physically at least, had changed very little in his parents' time and his time. His rage-filled manner didn't keep him from having an accurate assessment of how attentive he was. Here's how he described his surroundings. If an outbreak of more than usual violence occurs, as in 1935 or in 1943, it is met with sorrow and surprise and rage. The social hostility of the rest of the city feeds on this as proof that they were right all along. And the hostility increases. Speeches are made, committees are set up, investigations ensue. Steps are taken to right the wrong, without, however, expanding or demolishing the ghetto. Well, then there's the alternative viewpoint from someone who apparently wasn't afflicted, but you are very familiar with if you've watched my content.
People are astonished when I tell them I grew up in Harlem. I can't remember ever hearing a gunshot. And then I've checked with my relatives who grew up in similar neighborhoods in Washington and down in North Carolina. They never heard a gunshot when they were growing up.
Thomas Sowell lived in Harlem during the 1940s and 1950s. Him and his family moved there from North Carolina when he was a little boy, where he likely experienced the kind of racism that made a lot of black folks mass migrate out of the South. At least, I hope he admits to it. So, Baldwin and Sowell lived in the same city at the same time, yet kind of have different accounts of what life was like. To be clear, Sowell had it hard in his early years, according to him. Both of his parents died. He fought with his aunt who raised him and other kids around the way. He dropped out of school before turning his life around to become what we know him as today. Pretty much the only black person that white people listen to. In talking about Harlem, he mentions James Baldwin, who is 6 years older than him, by name in his book, Intellectuals and Race. Here's an excerpt.
What was different about the 1960s was the proliferation of people like James Baldwin, promoting resentments and polarization and making excuses for counterproductive and even barbaric behavior. Nor is this a phenomenon peculiar to blacks or even to the United States.
There's a lot to unpack there, including that this video is called The Lies of James Baldwin or something like that. Later, Sowell asked two questions. Was there a time before the 1960s when it was common for black people to urinate in public areas of buildings where they lived? And two, was that because they felt that whites had higher regards for them in earlier times? Sowell answers no to both. Okay. He would go on to quote this article from the New York Times and claim that there certainly wasn't less discrimination or racism in this earlier time period. So the difference in what he would call barbaric behavior of black people living in slums can't be due to white people. Before going here,
among the differences between the two eras was that the intelligentsia, both black and white, became more prone in the later period to make excuses, such as James Baldwin made, for moral squalor and barbaric behavior.
Intelligentsia? Fellow old heads, doesn't that sound like something Dipset will call themselves? Only Cameron will be able to rhyme that word. I should add that by moral squalor, Thomas Sowell meant, amongst other things, rioting. The thing that MLK said was the language of the unheard. And we already know that there were riots in 1935 and 1943. They're the occurrence of outbreaks of unusual violence that Baldwin mentioned, but whatever. Plus, you should know that Harlem in the 1930s featured Italian slums that those communities could hardly handle. No word on if they pissed in their own stairwells. There was also organized crime then, controlled by Dutch Schultz. And when he was gunned down in 1935, the Genovese family took over. The crime rate decreased during World War II, happens to be when Sowell was in grade school, and by the time he left Harlem and the 1960s arrived, Frank Lucas was moving heroin. So there's that. It's kind of like Thomas Sowell is trying to stick up for white people. Mace would put that on pause. Here's why I say this. Sowell made the mistake of claiming that the projects of Philadelphia and Walter Williams' era were radically different than those in later years. And we know from W.E.B. Du Bois' Philadelphia Negro that black slums were indeed in bad shape. And those came from what white people thought and felt about black people, which led to a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Because of prejudice against black workers and beliefs about their abilities and morals, trade labor unions didn't allow black workers to join. And because they couldn't join unions, many black workers couldn't get manufacturing or trade work, which paid much better than service work. And because they couldn't get these jobs, black communities had more men out of work, higher rates of poverty, and more criminal behavior, which then allowed the white workers and unions to justify their decision to not allow black workers into their union. The prevailing beliefs about race and racism ultimately reinforced themselves.
Racial formation theory, Crash Course versus Intellectuals and Race. The book where Thomas Sowell, with the utmost non-miserableness, seemed to have a problem with Kenneth B. Clark of the black baby doll test used in Brown versus Board of Education decision fame for his take on, quote, the ghetto violence of the 1960s. Clark said the riots aren't the issue. The frightening horror of Harlem is the chronic day-to-day violence in the human spirit, which exists and is accepted as normal. That's the real danger of Harlem. That's almost exactly what James Baldwin had been saying. Before I continue, one of my favorite quotes of all time came from Kenneth B. Clark. After he read the Kerner Commission from 1968, which found that poverty and institutional racism were driving inner city violence, Clark said, "It is as if I were reading the report of the Investigating Committee on the Harlem Riot of 35, the report of the Investigating Committee on the Harlem Riot of 43, the report of the Macomb Commission on the Watts Riot. I must again in candor say to you members of this commission, it is a kind of Alice in Wonderland, with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction." Did y'all notice that some of the takes from Thomas Sowell weren't based on data, but personal experience and feelings? Whenever I bring him up, I'm reminded by his fans that he used to be a Marxist until he looked at stats, facts, and figures. Amala Ekmanobi said something similar, and hey, for every one of those stories, there's another called My Flight from the Right. The point is, leftists, if you can't even focus on a baddie without thinking about what's making you sad and miserable, let alone have a good time.
Dude, like, oh my God, like, can we talk about like the political and economic state of the world right now?
There's a reason why. We should be doing something about the political and economical state of the world. At least we're attached to reality. After all, there's another study that says, rather than truly being happier than liberals, conservatives may be more prone to put a positive spin on their lives. There's a slight tendency on the part of political conservatives to self-enhance or view themselves in an unrealistically positive light. Me personally, I think it's sad and miserable when the right uses Malcolm X's words to enhance themselves while misquoting him. Yes, he is attributed to have said, "The white liberal is the worst enemy to America and the worst enemy to the black man. The white liberals are foxes who also show their teeth to the Negro but pretend that they're smiling. The white liberals are more dangerous than the conservatives." But that's not all he said. The white conservatives aren't friends of the Negro either, but they at least don't try to hide it. They are like wolves. They show their teeth in a snarl that keeps the Negro always aware of where he stands with them. What animal is the black conservative? Every January, Republicans stake claim to MLK Jr. being one of them and or a conservative, while ignoring the fact that he said, "It's all right to tell a man to lift himself up by his bootstraps, but it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. Black people in Harlem like boots without straps." I got to thinking about this topic a few weeks ago when I made a video that I wanted to call "The School Board Meeting to Politician Pipeline." While I was at it, I read about the school to prison pipeline, wanting to learn about what the conservative argument was against empirical evidence. I came across this video on YouTube entitled "The School to Prison Pipeline is a Myth." Here's why. From this common sense conservative with over 1 million subscribers, this dude avoids studies which prove that black preschoolers are getting expelled from school at rates higher than K-12 students, 250 black boys a day to be exact. And it's based on what teachers and who teachers perceive to be misbehaving. And an experiment suggests that teachers are watching black boys more often than other students to look for bad behavior. Kids who are kicked out of preschool are more likely to be kicked out of high school, and students kicked out of high school are much more likely to be incarcerated. And this N-word talked about a lack of parenting and values from parents for 14 minutes. He said poverty can't be the issue because even poor families can afford technology like an iPad and Wi-Fi, or those things are provided by school districts. So students really have no excuse not to do homework or complete their studies. Poverty leads to fatherlessness, and poor people have to work longer hours, which keeps them out of the home, and that doesn't allow for parents to help their kids with schoolwork. Children of people who are incarcerated are also more likely to be expelled from preschool. And I'm going to go against my better judgment and say that Anthony Bryan Logan wants to advocate for policies that will provide universal pre-K, paid family leave, dismissing nonviolent drug charges to get men out of prison, and raising the minimum wage.
This all started with slave labor. But Kunta don't need to read that. America won't raise the minimum wage because they're used to getting the work for free. That's why we need a higher minimum wage, because if they could get away with it, they'd pay you nothing. It's not slavery, it's perpetual poverty.
Nunchucks is crazy. Never mind what I said earlier. LeVar Burton be fighting all the time. I'm a leftist, progressive, independent. And when it comes to me, I'm not going to say I'm compassionate or empathetic. I hate being miserable. It's awesome. Just as long as I'm taking action and seeking justice. And if that makes me a sad human being, then so what? We gonna be all right.
No, he can do some things that you can't do. You can do some things that he can't do. I can do some things that neither of you can do. You know, I know I can't drive a truck. You know, and I can't run a bank. You know, I can't count. You know, and I can't lead a movement. But I can fuck up your mind.